This is going to be the video where we really flesh out this idea of signal flow and what makes something modular. And why is it that I said most instruments are hybrid modular? If you remember, I said that I think a few videos ago that most synthesizers you come across are really hybrids with a lot of modular elements to them. And that's why we're going to go through this progression of synthesizers. So we've looked at the DAW as kind of a modular device. We saw that there were like mixing suites of plugins, and we briefly looked at Serum and explained how that could be viewed as something modular. Well, now we're really going to go through this kind of in depth and really kind of pound this idea into your head of what makes something modular. And what does make something modular is control over the signal flow, where you can do things that don't always make sense. It means you'll get much more diverse sounds. Doesn't always mean more practical sounds, so don't confuse the two. Just because I'm saying with modular, you can get the craziest timbres ever, that doesn't mean that's always going to be useful in the productions that you're working on. But we're going to begin here with the polysynth, which is probably, of all the instruments I have, the most hardwired. I can't change a whole lot about the signal flow of this instrument. And when we say signal flow, we mean the path of the audio. Where is it going? How is it generated? How is it manipulated? And how is it eventually output? Okay, so here we start with our two oscillators. All right, these can be made identical. We can adjust the shape, whatever. From there, we have a little bit of a mixer setting where we can bring in noise. We can adjust the mix balance between the two oscillators. We can do any other gain settings we need to do, or we can globally adjust the pitch on both of these at the same time. Obviously, we can do it manually if we want. From there, and this instrument is just going left to right for the most part, we move into a filter, and this is what makes it subtractive. So I have here my oscillator balance. And then going into the filter, I can cut some of that off. Or bring it back in, but it would be pretty tiresome to have to constantly do this ourselves, so we do have an envelope that will do that for us, attack, decay, sustain, and release, something we'll be looking at more. After the filter, we go into the amplitude envelope. So it's filter envelope into the amplitude envelope. This is actually setting how the sound is going to play out. So if we go in here really quick and just turn off the filter envelope entirely, you'll hear as I bring the release up, if I tap a key, you can see that release stage like so. And then we have our final output here. We can adjust whether or not we want to make this instrument mono, if we want to have any glide, the velocity sensitivity, etc. And this is pretty much the signal flow in your subtractive synthesizer. You have your oscillator, you have your filter, you have your amplitude envelope, and then you have the final output stage. So you're wondering, what about these other two categories here? What about these two blocks of controls? Well, this first block is some of your modulators, your LFOs, your low frequency oscillators, and these don't really fit in with signal flow, and you'll see that with Spire, how they're divided, and oftentimes you have a top and a bottom because these can be mapped to anything, and they're not really a part of the signal flow, so to speak, mainly because they could go wherever I want them to go. So I could have this LFO controlling the shape of this first oscillator here, but I could also have it controlling the filter. Or even controlling the output. Or of course, I guess panning is always the easier one to hear. Right, so we have that LFO there, and that can be going anywhere at any time. Same thing with our other modulators here. We have velocity, we have key tracking. This is something special to this particular program, so we'll skip over that one. But we do have then our filter envelope, which is this one here, then our amplitude envelope. So for example, if we want to use this filter envelope to again control the shape, what we're going to do is we're going to have an attack, long decay, and then the sustain is just going to come down. So we're going to watch this shape go up and come down. That happened kind of fast. Let's increase the attack time. And And then when it finishes, the sustain is at 0, right? So it goes all the way back down, but I could bring that up, and so it's going to stop somewhere in the middle. You can see where it's stopping. Let's bring that up even further. All right, we see it stops there. Then when I let go of this key, it's going to immediately go to the bottom because there's no release. If I bring that up a little bit, kind of have it match with what's going on here with the amplitude envelope, we'll watch and see how it then decays off right at the end. So let's follow it. Like so. Okay, so a little bit smoother. We could have it match if we want it to be perfect, or even have this be longer, in which case it wouldn't make it back down to the bottom. But the main point of me showing you this is that these envelopes, these LFOs, these modulators, they kind of exist outside of the signal flow. They're kind of on their own, and they can be mapped and routed to whatever you want to map and route them to. And with this instrument, it's so easy because we just have these little arrows, and then we're ready to go and start modulating with them. But for the most part, this instrument has a very hard and fast, strict signal flow. I can't adjust where the filter falls in this, right? I just can't change anything about that. I can change the different filter types, but that's pretty much it, right? I can't actually go in here and adjust. There's just not a lot of controls in here, and I don't know why I would ever want to do this, but I can't say only have the filter acting on one of these oscillators. Okay, it's operating on both of them. No matter how I adjust this mix, right, assuming there's some sound coming from both of these, I can't only have the filter pay attention to one. It has to pay attention to both. Very basic instrument here, about as basic as it's going to get, and of course, completely hardwired. So up next, we're going to look at Spire. And let's just go ahead and initialize this patch. And with Spire, what you get is actually a very nice visual signal flow here. And this instrument is a little bit deeper with what you can do, obviously, but the process is still the same. We have our oscillators. We can go through our different oscillators here like so. We can adjust different things about these oscillators. So there are different types. So we have FM, AM sync, saw Pauthwich modulation. This also actually acts like more of a wavetable if you want it to. You can see how that's adjusting. We can put this onto something different and have that go. And these controls right here, this already makes this instrument much more of a modular design because we're getting these additional controls. And I always think about it this way. When you have an analog synthesizer, like I have a base station sitting here, I can't go in and get a contextual menu and suddenly be going through all of these different options. It just doesn't work like that. There are actual hardware parts inside of that that are generating the sound. It's not as easy as just kind of clicking through. And that ease of convenience is part of what makes modular in the computer so desirable for most instrument designs, most software plugins anyway. So I have my 4 different oscillators, and we can then follow along and see, okay, for this first oscillator, which is the only thing that's on, I could increase the voices. Adjust the detune and go in here, and I'm going to adjust the panning just so you get a feel for what I'm doing. And then with the second one, if I go up to number 2, all of these now revert back. So I have all of these controls for each of my oscillators that are going in. So we could maybe change this to something different. What makes this cool is I could then change the panning. But each of these controls is then different, and then this is following along with our signal flow. So we could have the second oscillator. This is what's kind of making it modular here. I could have the second oscillator going only into filter number 2 and have the first oscillator only going into filter number 1. And here is where we then find our filter controls here, right? So I could go in here and I have all of these different adjustments and selections for my filters. And this is very much, again, a modular idea. It's like I'm swapping out different filters in real time. If I had a modular synthesizer, which we will get to by the end of this video, hopefully within the next 20 minutes or so, I would actually have to take a screwdriver, unscrew the module, and put something else in, unless it came with a bunch of different things already built into it. But we could imagine that all we have is a low pass and we have a high pass. We'd have to change that into the signal flow in order to get that to work. From there, we go into our effects. And in this instrument, these effects already have a hardwired signal flow. So it starts with a distortion, then it goes into a phaser, followed by going into a chorus, then a delay, then a reverb. And then from there, we come down to the bottom, which is our output setting that also has some kind of a multi-band compressor to it. We can again adjust the velocity sensitivity, and then we have an EQ that we can work with as well if we want to do that all the way at the end before we come out at the final output stage. And again, our modulators exist down here on the bottom with envelopes and then LFOs, which in order to route them, we can either do it from up here or we can go into the modulation matrix, which gives us a little bit more control, or I should just say more places to modulate if we need more than just two different destinations for the sound. So you can see that the difference between the polysynth and Spire is that with Spire, we have a lot more control. We have a lot more options. Arguably, we just have more modules that we can choose from and we can manipulate. And that's what synthesizers in the computer are all about. It's giving you as many options as possible, conveniently being able to switch between them. And again, I think that that really harkens back to the early days of modular synthesis and having those modules in there that you can, easily screw out and replace, at least in more contemporary times. The next instrument we're going to briefly look at on this journey to full-blown modular is Massive. For the most part, Massive is hardwired. And if we go into the routing tab, we can see that there's a lot of things that we really can't move. Like I can't adjust the filter position, but I can adjust things where they fall in relation to the filter is kind of the biggie. So let's just do one quick example. And I'm just going to turn these other guys off, put this into sine triangle. Let's go to triangle real quick. Just open up this gate. Cool. Now I want to head into the routing. All right. So right now, we don't have any filter action going on. I'm going to route, and this is very much modular. I'm going to route this first oscillator all into filter number 1. It's not going to sound any different because we don't have any filter. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to add one of these insert effects. That's what this INS1 stands for, and we can find it down here at the bottom. We'll also experiment with feedback in a little while. But I'm going to choose the hard clipper because I know this one is going to give me some overtones that we can easily hear. Right, like so. So what this readout is telling me right now, and I'll leave it up to you to experiment with these things further, but what this is telling me is that the insert effect is falling after the filter. So if I was to bring on, let's say, and I'm just going to turn this off for now, if I was to bring on a low-pass filter, we can hear how that's cutting off some of the harmonics, right? And so when I turn this on, it's reacting to what's happened after the filter. But let's adjust this. Why don't we put this in front of the filter instead? And now obviously it's going to be cutting off much more aggressively. Right, we can turn off the filter, hear the effect, bring that filter back on. Or if we want to get really creative, we could send this to both. Or actually, why don't we go into serial mode here? What we're going to do is now actually put this in the middle. All right, so now it's following the first filter. That's when the insert is happening. That's when the drive is happening. But then if we were to bring in a second filter, we're now cutting it off. Or this could happen after both of the filters. Or at like the output stage here, all the way at the end of the signal flow. So you can hear how this does make a pretty radical difference in where you put this. Now we are looking at Serum, and hopefully you're starting to see some trends with these instruments. We have our main signal flow happening at the top from left to right, very much hardwired, except now we do have a few more controls. For example, if I want to bring in a sub-oscillator, and let me just bring ourselves down here. Let's put it down. Right, you can hear that like so. One option that we have is that we could send this direct out, meaning that if I was to go in here and to use a high pass filter, turn that on, you can hear how this sub is not impacted by the filter. We get that modular control. We can have it bypass this and just come straight out. But for the most part, this instrument is very much hardwired. And if you're looking at this, it's very basic. That's because this instrument is all in the oscillators themselves and what you can do. And we've looked at it a little bit already, and we'll spend a lot more time with that, I believe, next week. But what I'm going to show you that now kind of makes this a whole nother level from Massive is that inside of Massive, we didn't have control over where our effects were going to necessarily fall in the signal flow apart from just the two that we had. Here, we could do something like, for example, let's turn the sub off. Let's put this to be a low pass, because you might be wondering, well, why are there not two filters? Like, why would I want to use one filter on A, not on B, and have like B just coming through really high end and bright? And I'll show you why right now. So you can hear how B is still just like blasting through there. And let's do something just to make this sound a little bit different. And let's have this be doing something different. Maybe we'll choose a different like wavetable here. Bring down the octave on this one. So you might wonder, like, okay, why would I want to have this sort of a setup? I'll put an LFO on here. But it's still very like high-endy because of the B, and I want to cut some of that off, but I don't want this exact same movement happening. Well, this is where it gets really interesting, because I can go into the effects, for example, and I could add in just a couple of things. I could adjust the positioning of them. And let's even add on, like, I don't know, a delay. I'm not liking the way this tube is sounding. But the cool parts of this is I could actually then add a filter on at the end. And this filter is now controlling both. And then if I wanted to use an envelope on this filter, I could do that. Let's say we want a little bit of reverb happening, but we want the reverb at the end. So the filter is not impacting this reverb. This reverb is going to be as bright as I want it to be. Or we can really close it down if we want to. this is thanks in large part to what's going on with our effects and being able to manipulate where we put them. Because if we put the reverb on the other side of this filter, you'll hear just how much darker it's going to make that sound. All right, so that's Serum, and those are the modular options that you get with this particular instrument. I know a lot of people are going to argue, well, you know, this is all just the effects being modular, and you already showed us that with the DAW, but hey, it's something to be aware of in these instruments, because I think what you'll see is that from the main page with the sound generation sources, there's a lot we can do, and there's a lot we can modulate here, but for the most part, it is just following that basic signal flow until you jump into the effects and realize that there's a whole world of sound just waiting for you to explore, because these modulators can go to, you know, any of these parameters inside of the effects as well. We're now looking at Absynth, and we're starting to get into more or less what modular is all about, or where it gets its reputation. Mainly that you set up what you want, where you want it. You determine the signal flow. You're not having the instrument do that for you. Of course, we kind of have to start with an oscillator or with something that's going to generate a sound. That's something that you really can't avoid, even with pure modular. I mean, you can try to set something up, it just isn't going to make a sound. So here we have just our single sine wave, but we can obviously adjust that. Let's go with, I don't know, saw smooth. We can very quickly just go in here and add some unison. And just create ourselves more or less a super saw. Now, if I want to go basic with this and create more of just your classic subtractive synthesizer, I could come in here and just add a basic filter. And by default, we have a low pass filter. We could obviously then set some kind of modulator to control this parameter, and it's very easy to do that. All I have to do is sort of right click and choose to create a new envelope, or I could actually go to my LFOs and make the adjustments there. But what I love about Absynth is that I don't have to use a filter in this position. I could use something totally different. I could go in here and start by putting on, I don't know, a comb, which is actually still more of a filter. So let's not use the comb. Let's use the ring modulator. Hear what that's doing, and if we change the wave shape here, we could get something really crazy probably. I wonder if I'm allowed to use any of the Morse waves. Let's try that. Let's actually not use note. Let's go back to let's use ratio. Create something that's kind of like a saw, but also has this element of something different. And then if I wanted to, at the end, I could go in here and use a filter, right? But on the flip side, we could also just flip the logic to this around, and we could start with that filter and then follow the filter with something different. We could use another filter, or again, we could go in here and grab something that's just a little bit different. We could go and grab the super comb. We have a lot of controls on the super comb. there's a resonance in here somewhere. There it is. And this is why I just love this instrument so much. We could have a whole nother chain going here, an oscillator B, and we'll go in here and just choose like a double. And let's go with just anything. Who really cares? We can adjust the mix balance here. So I'm obviously not going for like a real sound here. And then here on the master, we then are going to run both things through whatever we bring in here. So we could obviously go with a wave shaper. We could use a frequency shifter. I just love this instrument so much to experiment with. Because you just don't know what you're going to get. And that's modular in kind of a nutshell, is that I'm just experimenting with settings. I'm bringing in different modules here. I could obviously go in here and start trying to find something else if I wanted to. Of course, we can bring in effects as well. That's always fun. We'd actually have to go into the effects section to adjust it. And it's truly like every note I hit is completely different because of how we have this going into these wave shapers and everything else. So I could spend easily 2 to 3 hours just messing around in this instrument and sort of seeing what happens. And that's the beauty and joy of something a little bit more modular. We're now looking at a synthesizer from Yuhi that's called Modular. And this is going to be our first encounter with virtual patch cables. But just because we're inside of the computer doesn't mean that the only modular synthesizers are the ones that give you virtual patch cables. I would argue that Absynth is very much a modular synth, and it's actually a very free-form modular synth, whereas you can almost get more diverse timbres in that instrument than you can with this one, because this reminds me a lot more of a very old-school modular setup, kind of like the old Moog modular, where they had a lot of modules already in there in advance, like kind of just preset, and they were what they were. It's not like today with the Euro racks where you can decide that you want a different filter, and you can very quickly unscrew one filter and screw in another one. That sort of thing just doesn't really exist here with Modular, and that's why you can argue that it's not as capable of diverse timbres as some of the stuff that we've looked at before. And in order to hear sound, we actually have to set this up. So I'm hitting notes and we're not hearing anything. That's because I need to go into one of these outputs. You can see that we have 4 outputs if we want to take each of these oscillators in and, use one for output 2, one for output 1, a basic mixing scheme along with volume controls. We'll do that here quickly just so I can show it to you. We'll be spending a lot more time with this instrument later on, so I just want to go through this fairly quickly, but we could go here. We could go take this one, come in here. And then take our other 2. And these are both just sine waves. And I can adjust it. But this is kind of like not that useful, because what if I want to send all of these guys through to the same filter? I only have 2 options to run into the filter, so I'd actually have to do something a little bit different. I'd have to use more or less this multiplex here. Bring these 2 guys in. Bring these 2 guys in. And then I could go out of this, and I can go into the filter. And then from the filter selection, I have to choose one. And then if I want an envelope on this filter, I need to go to one of these envelopes, and I actually have to go in here to a modulation source. Then maybe I want an LFO controlling the resonance. This is the biggest issue with this instrument, is trying to sometimes see where it needs to go, and obviously it has to go underneath. Maybe we'll use random. That might actually be cooler. This is an instrument that, again, you can spend a lot of time playing with, but I want to show this one to you mainly as an example of a modular synth that has these hardwired modules, as compared to what we're going to see with our last 2 instruments, where we have the ability to more or less set our own modules and determine the signal flow in that way. We're now looking at Yuhi's Zebra, which I don't actually own, so I've just like deactivated the whole instrument so it's not going to start spitting random MIDI notes in, which might completely break my flow here. But this is the perfect instrument to bridge that gap between what we just looked at with Botzilla and what we're going to be looking at with the reactor blocks. And at some point, I definitely have this instrument on my wish list. Maybe somebody can send it to me for free. Shameless plug there. But it would be an instrument that I would do probably a whole bonus section on, because it operates a lot like Absynth, a lot like Reaktor, as kind of your jack of all trades instrument. And it's based on really purely a modular signal flow. So each of these rows is really a chain that you can fill up with different modules. All of these modules are, of course, built into this instrument, unlike Reaktor, where you can kind of grab things from all over the place. But we have so much we can work with here. So if we want an oscillator, we can bring the oscillator in, and then we can determine what comes next. So do we want some kind of like distortion, and then follow that up with a filter? Right? And you'll actually see on the left here, this is the signal flow in the middle, but sometimes it doesn't always add up, so you have to kind of click and move things around. But we could go oscillator, distortion, filter, or we could obviously flip it around, and it goes all the way down, and it actually goes even much deeper than this. I can take these guys, and by double-clicking, I deactivate it, or I can right-click and remove it. Really, I'm just mostly concerned with showing you the signal flow here, and you'll notice that this oscillator seems pretty simple, like at first glance, but there's a lot you can actually do with it here. And we can go into a mode like 11 voices, and we can actually go and scan between different waves. And you can even go in here and you can draw in your own wave. I don't remember which is the one that does that, but you can draw it in, and then you can do things like sharpen it or maximize it and so forth, and take things further. And so you can actually scroll through to the different waves. Why don't we actually open up one of these presets here? And that way you can actually see the different waves that you can select through. And a lot of these work like wavetables, so you can obviously modulate this with something like an LFO, and it would bring that LFO up here, and you could obviously do the modulation. But you'll see with the filters as well, we have a ton of different options. Some of these aren't even filters. They actually have, well, phasers are kind of technically filters, but we're not going to go into that in this course. But you can see so many different options here, and really the sky's the limit. So I can even go further and do something a little bit more modular, and I could take the FM oscillators, and I could then, for example, have this second one take the input from number 1, and you can see how it hooks it up like so. And now if we were to be working with this, if I was adjusting things here, if I was adjusting things here, we could actually mute this first one, only work with the second one, and kind of go to town with that. And again, I'm not going to go into too much depth. I just wanted to show you how this is exactly working and kind of like how far you can really push things if you want to. And the same thing is true with the effects bank down here. I could go in and I could choose to have like a compressor here, and we have the compressor controls there, obviously. And then after the compressor, I could choose to work with like an EQ. And again, we do have the option to use filters in here, distortion, reverb, all that fun stuff. And we even have more details as we go. So really changing a lot of modules. This instrument is capable of really just a diverse sound set. Many of you, I'm sure, are aware, but I think most of the sounds for The Dark Knight maybe were made using Zebra. So it's a powerful instrument. And definitely something, if you haven't purchased any synthesizer, it's one to consider picking up, because a lot of the modular concepts we'll be looking at moving forward in Reaktor, you can apply to Zebra. And oftentimes it's just a little bit easier in here because you have all your different options, right at those contextual menus. And it's a very deep instrument. So I'm not going to spend any more time confusing you with it, but I just thought I'd share it because it definitely bridges that gap nicely between what we have in Reaktor and what we just looked at with Botzilla. We've now made it to the end of our journey, and we're here looking at Reaktor. What makes Reaktor so modular? Well, I'll tell you. It's this blank slate here in front of us. Inside of Reaktor, if you know what you're doing, you can start from complete scratch and make something just unbelievably complex. And we're actually going to look at something very basic here to start. This is the two-osk. All right, and so we can listen to this instrument. And that sounds pretty dang good, but underneath the hood here, what we're going to see is this instrument is made up of a bunch of little component parts, a bunch of modules, if you want to use that terminology. And so when I open this up, this is the two-osk right here. All right, not too intimidating, but I can open it up, and now we're starting to see all of these different modules that make this instrument up. And so when you look at it from kind of the far away view, I can't think of the right word, the aerial view, so to speak, you'll see all of our major parts to this instrument. We have a filter 1 that corresponds to this section of the instrument, filter 2, this corresponds to this section of the instrument. It's almost as if you could open up or see the back end of your traditional synthesizers that you bring in. That is what Reaktor is, and you can go all the way in there. And we have now the next layer where we see a lot of our knobs. So you can see the cutoff knob, it turns red when I click on it. It corresponds to that. We have the resonance here, so forth and so forth. We can open up the filter and look further, open this up, go further still, 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 etc., etc., etc. And at some point, somebody did actually, sit down and create all of this. And if you know what you're doing, you can edit some of these things. I know how to make a very basic instrument using this particular style, but it's kind of boring. It's kind of tedious. It's a lot of math. And if you're a music maker, you don't want that. You want to have your modules ready to go. And so that's what Reaktor 6 gives us the ability to do. But Reaktor 1 to Reaktor 5 was all about working in this sort of an environment and creating your instruments from scratch or editing instruments that other people have created. If you look at the Reaktor user library, you'll see just how amazing of things people can do. And all of the things that are in here, whether it's an effect, a groove box, a sampler, a synthesizer, a sound generator, to some degree, it is built using these very basic building blocks and really figuring out how to combine them all to come up with a great instrument like this guy right here, the two-osk. And let's just choose some other preset and see if there's something cool that's going on with it. Let's see if we have something a little bit better than that. That's kind of lame, isn't it? What about this one? Well, I'll leave it up to you to find some really interesting snapshots with this instrument, because I'm going to very quickly introduce you to what we will be working on and looking at moving forward in this section. So we got to see how things worked in Reaktor versions 1 through 5, but now here in Reaktor 6, they have introduced a new way to creating instruments, something that's much more user-friendly and really emulates the Eurorack style of modular synthesis, where you are given, for the most part, preset blocks or preset modules, and then it's up to you to connect them to get that signal flow that you want to get, and then to ultimately make sounds. So we can start with this blocks new. This is kind of a template. We don't have to use everything that's in here, and for this quick example, we're going to go ahead and get rid of most of these things. So now we just have a note in, and you can see when I'm hitting a MIDI note, it is triggering, so that has already been set up in advance. And then we have a final output kind of that we can adjust, and it gives us a slider like so. But you'll notice that each of these blocks is built up similar to what we just saw with the instrument, where I can go in here and actually see how this has all been created. And so if you want, people have gone out of their way to make some really great reaktor blocks. So that's kind of the new community now, are people making these blocks as compared to making full-blown ensembles. So in a way, it gives you a little bit more flexibility as the user to come up with some pretty cool sounds. I mentioned before a modular instrument, whether that's something like Zebra or even going all the way back to Spire, it's really only as powerful as the modules that you're given. So in the case of Spire, it's only as powerful as the different filter algorithms or the different oscillator algorithms. And it's true here in Reaktor as well, only we really break things down much, much further. So you can see here in our first little category, we get all the things that we need to make the most basic of instruments. But as we go through, all of these guys are in one way or another modules that can be used. So you can see in Monarch, we have a filter, we have an oscillator, and we have some kind of an ADS envelope. And these things could be used to create an instrument, but I could go back to the bento box here. We have a VCA, we have an ADSR, we have an oscillator, we have a, what was the other thing? A filter. All right, so all of those things are available to us to create this instrument. We just have to patch it all together. But like I mentioned before, other people have made some great stuff. So I actually added one of those. This is the microwave oscillator. This is from the Reaktor user library. And this oscillator gives us a few more settings and controls than the traditional oscillator that we can work with. So this one actually gives us a bunch of different wave tables we can work with, and we can scan through it. And obviously, if we had an ADSR or an LFO, we could modulate that parameter. But everything for, in this case, has to be set up on our own. So why don't we just start with something very simple? We have our oscillator in here, and we're going to move this around to kind of get the signal flow correct. We'll take the pitch, and we'll run it in. All right, so now by default, this is going to key track appropriately. So if I play some notes, we then have to connect the output, obviously. But now if I play some notes, it's going to track that up and down like so. I'll just go ahead and mute it to get rid of it. And that's kind of a problem here, right? We can't control, we don't have an envelope shaping this sound. And so we can, of course, remedy that situation by bringing in some kind of a VCA, a voltage-controlled amplifier. And this VCA will allow us to now kind of have more control over how that sound gets loud and it gets quiet. So if I bring the output in here, and then I take the output and bring it back in, you can see this is muted. I start to bring this up. We're getting level. But right now I'd have to just control it with my hand. And I don't really want to have to do that. So maybe we should get some kind of an envelope to do it for us. And we see we have an ADSR envelope right here. So with the ADSR envelope, this is where things get a little bit confusing, and this is where it's really Reaktor terminology. I actually need to have the output of this going into a modulation source. And when I go into that modulation source, you can see how it's lit up. I'll get rid of it. I want you to watch what's happening here. All right, it's going to light up that A section. And when I click on it, it gives me the ability to then set the destination. And with this particular module, I only have one option, and that's to control this level here. So I can set the depth of the modulation, and then I'm going to take the gate, the information of the note click, that's going to come here from the note in. All right, so that goes into the gate like so. And now when we hit a note, we're getting that message like so, and I can go and I can change the shape of this oscillator. We can then adjust the gain here, bring that down a little bit. And then we can use the envelope like we normally would. So we'll do more of like a pad type thing. We'll have a 2-second attack, a 2-second decay, or around there. We'll have it sustain at about 50%. And so you can actually, maybe this envelope you can't. I know at least one of them you can change how exactly this shape is happening. I guess you can adjust the curves here, but notice how these readouts come out. And it's very important that these kind of go on an exponential. So 50% of the envelope is actually more at like 3/4, just as an FYI. And then we'll go with like a 2-second release. And what I love about this for teaching synthesis to people is that this gives us so much great visual feedback. Not only have we had to connect these modules ourselves, but we can actually watch and see then what's happening. So if I hit a note, attack, decay, sustain, I let go of the key, release. And so just like that, you can start to experiment with your ADSR envelope and you learn it like so quickly because of how great this visual feedback is. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to start with modular synthesis, because we get so much great readout and we can make those connections in our head on how we're patching and connecting everything together. All right, so after this, we're going to go deeper with the reactor blocks, talk about these different modules, some things we can do, and just how to get creative and experimental.